Hello, welcome to this extra bonus lecture for students at Mount Sophia Academy's Ancient Medieval History class. This is Mr. Han, and I'm recording this now to give you an opportunity to hear it at your leisure over the course of the next week before we have our final meeting on the Roman Empire, in which I'll focus on the topic for today, Rome versus Christianity. If you're here as someone who's not a student of Mount Sophia, I hope you enjoyed the presentation, and I think you'll find it interesting. I am going to argue a thesis to the students, and I am very, very focused on just getting them the information they need to play a game next week, a problem-based learning exercise. So let's get started. I believe that Rome's struggle with Christianity was part of God's plan for the world. But look at the timing. Rome created conditions perfect for the spread of the gospel, and Christianity supplied so much of what was missing from life for the people of Rome, the heart of a good life, the value on life. Those are things that Rome could never have given us. And that's one of my arguments today. One of my themes today is that Rome is without question an ancient society. And we copied many things, as you saw, from their government, but this is something that they could never have given us, the value on life and much of what we would call our social and philosophical impact. Rome tolerated almost every religion that they came in conflict with, and they came in conflict with so many as they conquered the entire Mediterranean region and Europe. But they persecuted a few faiths, and the Christians were among them. They absolutely had to do that. And that's part of what I have to explain today. As curious as it seems, peaceful, loving, meek Christians had to be exterminated, and the Romans couldn't do it. They were the most ruthless, efficient, heartless killers probably in all of history, not in terms of barbarians raiding, but in terms of an organized, disciplined effort to kill people. There was probably no one better than the Romans, and yet they could not overcome the Christians. That's something I have to explain to you today. First of all, let's take a look at these two pieces of artwork here, which show people being crucified. I want to emphasize, for those of you who don't get it yet, crucifixion was not a unique form of punishment that the Romans invented for Jesus of Nazareth, like they've never done it before and never did it since. That's out of the question. They crucified thousands of people, and they did it for a very deliberate reason. They chose people whom they felt had incurred what they call infamia, shame, disgrace. And they chose to execute them in not just a painful way, an agonizingly painful way, but also in a very public way, because the Romans were interested in making an example and in inflicting shame, that infamia, on the noxii, the criminals who were noxious to their society. And the thing that's unique about the death of Jesus is that they succeeded, of course, in the first goal, inflicting pain, but they utterly failed in the second. Let me just turn off this light. There we go. All right. It's hard to assess Rome's culture in regards to religion. You need to understand a few things. First of all, there was no such thing as a separation of church and state for them. Both went completely together, and were almost indistinguishable in terms of which was the priority. Blasphemy was treason, and vice versa when your king is a god, the Roman emperor, just like in Egypt and Persia and so forth. Rome was remarkable because the empire was, on the one hand, extremely tolerant of other religious traditions. Rome had their own, but they freely copied and incorporated aspects of many other religions into their one big faith. But the Romans did not really value that faith the way we normally think of the term. And whenever Rome could not tolerate a religion or custom, or of course revolts against their authority, then you saw how horribly cruel the Romans could be. Like all cultures to come before them, the Romans saw plenty of reasons to die and even more reasons to kill. Romans believed in setting an example against rebellion and treason. And while they practically invented the whole idea of citizenship, they did not apply it very evenly. And God help you, literally, if you were not a citizen of Rome when one of these charges came to the fore. Most ancient religions did not carry such a personal, crucial message for the vast majority of people in the world. If sacrifices of animals were important, well, who could afford to do those? Attendance at long and complex religious rituals were out of the question for most people, and only the Greeks had ever told tales of the gods taking any kind of real personal interest in individuals, most of the time still with the wealthiest and most nobly born humans, and often not to their benefit. For the most part, subjects of the Roman Empire had it pretty good, even compared to being independent. Like all empires, Rome required taxes, a levy of men for the army, and obedience to its laws and court decisions. Rebellion was met with the crushing weight of the full Roman Empire and never really succeeded. Retribution was usually harsh, but in return for obedience, Rome protected the subject people from outside invasion by the Western barbarians or from Persia. They provided unheard of infrastructure like roads and aqueducts and other public buildings, gave access to trade from across the empire for virtually anything you could want to buy or sell. Most crucially, membership as one of Rome's subjects held the prospect of eventually being raised to citizen status. This was like nothing any other empire before had ever done. You could actually earn your way or even buy your way to the status of a citizen and be an equal in court, get out from under certain taxes and so forth. So the famous phrase about the carrot and the stick, the carrot was pretty good looking. Rome also tolerated the customs of its subject peoples to a very wide extent, including religious practices and customs. By the time Christ was born, there was a bizarre bazaar of sects, cults, religious philosophies running all around the empire. Picture it almost like a large mall filled with different religions, one in each different booth, and you can have whatever you like. Fertility cults aimed at pleasing women, tough guys, secret societies like Mithras for the soldiers and the would-be heroes. You see a picture of Mithras up there wrestling a bull into death, but with his bare hands. The Greek gods and goddesses, the whole range of stories around them. And then there were powerful dualistic ideas like Zoroastrianism, which came out of the area of ancient Persia, where there's a good god and there's an evil god, and they're basically fighting it out, and we don't know who's going to win. That's dualism, right? And then there are even those wacky Jews who do almost everything different than right-thinking folks back in the Roman Empire. The Jews were incredibly literate, but they wrote in the wrong direction. They couldn't eat the most commonly eaten meat in the entire world. Pork, by far, was the most commonly eaten meat across the ancient Roman world. They couldn't work or even fight one day a week on their Sabbath, which made them completely unsuitable for being in the army, which you had to be. So they were something of a real exception to the rules, and the Romans tolerated them really as best they could for as long as they could. Oh, and by the way, we almost forgot the emperor in Rome, he's a god too. No big deal. So why, in this big happy family, would Rome decide to put its foot down and persecute some religions, any religions? Why would they pursue some of those religions to the death? It has to do again with what the Romans cared about and what they didn't. In a general, almost impersonal way, the Romans were quite religious, but today we would have said that the Romans valued the state way above the church. If you transgressed Rome's few token religious obligations, then you were risking getting everyone in trouble with the gods. You might say that Rome could blame anything bad that happened, like plagues or earthquakes, on people not doing their religious duty. But again, this was not a religion with a personal message for each of us as individuals, or a relationship with God that encouraged us in any significant way. Sacrificing to the emperor once a year or so was seen in much the same way as your obligation to vote, except the penalty for disobedience was death. In the chart, you can see some important ways in which Rome differed from religious traditions that eventually suffered its persecution. For example, the Celtic Druids maintained an alternate source of authority over the people of Gaul, even after their chieftains had been conquered. The practice of human sacrifice was another violation the Romans could not stomach. No one gets to put people to death except us. But that means that the people following the Druidic religion valued their church, their religious views, over obedience to those who had conquered them. So the Druids were hunted down without mercy, and the Celtic provinces after that were assimilated fairly well into Rome's ways. The Jews, as I said, were a constant headache to Rome. No matter which of the empire's few obligations were brought up, the Hebrews had a problem with it. And the Romans actually bent over backwards to try and accommodate the Jews. One man got to sacrifice on behalf of the entire nation to the emperor, and then he had to go off and purify himself afterwards. And the Jews were excused from having to serve in the military because they needed to take every Sabbath off, and they wouldn't budge on that custom. Now they had to pay extra taxes for those privileges, but again, they objected that Caesar's face on the coin was idol worship. So they were allowed to pay their extra taxes in barter. And even so, Judea kept revolting against Roman rule, and eventually Rome crushed the Jews and scattered them in what's called the diaspora, forbidding them from living in the Holy Land anymore and pushing them all across the empire to keep their rebellious ways from harming the body politic. But the Christians, here was a special case. Far from advocating human sacrifice, the Christians believed one man had already sacrificed his life for everyone else. Their leader, Jesus, advised his followers to pay their taxes, had no objection to military service or even life as a slave. Christians focused on something completely different, the inner life of each individual, and a message of personal salvation. You didn't have to be rich. In fact, it might be better for you if you were poor. Here was a message that was radically open, easy to follow, or at least to understand, and did not require money or special items or trained priests to communicate. But Christianity unambiguously required its followers to acknowledge only one master, God. And that the Romans could never tolerate. Rome persecuted the Christians, at first misunderstanding and underestimating them, but later with all its might for that reason. And when it came to the stick of carrot and stick, Rome's stick had spikes in it. This was a people raised to value stoic toughness, even cruelty from its very origins. Remember, this was a time when infant mortality, plague, war, famine, and rough conditions threatened your life from cradle to grave. Romans valued the good death almost more than the good life. In the Roman family, the father, the figure of the father, was revered well beyond his place today. The father in Rome was almost like a king, like a god. The wife had no say over what happened with the family overall, and the children weren't even acknowledged until they were about 4 years old and given a name. And when that child was 4, he was given a name, but still completely subject to his father's direction. In fact, the father could abuse, wound, or even kill a child and not be considered guilty of a crime under Roman law. So this was part of how they grew up from an early age. When Roman soldiers disobeyed orders in combat or retreated without permission, it was typical to discipline the unit by decimating it, lining up the soldiers with a centurion walking behind the line and stabbing every 10th man in the back. Decimation, right? Like decade, every 10th man in the back killed, so that the survivors knew better than to do that again. They were willing to kill 10% of the unit to inflict discipline. Rome, like most empires before it, made examples of rebellious provinces with complete destruction of their cities, like Corinth and Carthage were. Taking the defeated populations as slaves was quite typical. And then there was the example of what the Romans did for fun. And now we'll have to talk about gladiatorial combat for a little bit. Here you see a picture of the Colosseum down left and a more typical smaller arena in the upper right, a model being made of it. The Romans, when I talk about them being heartless, cruel people with no value on the quality of life, this is it right here. This is what they did for entertainment. They went to the arenas and watched people die by the hundreds and thousands. How did you get gladiators to staff this? Mostly it was these naxii, people who were condemned for mortal crimes against the state, rebellion, sedition, refusal to obey the emperor in some major way. They were guilty of crimes. And so they were the worst, the lowest of society. Instead of hanging them, which would be a shameful sort of form of execution in the modern era, they sometimes crucified them, but they often took them into the arena. And prisoners of war, in the same way, were treated as those who had betrayed Rome, rebelled against Rome, and they could be thrown into the arena to fight again Maybe you'll live, maybe you'll die, but the people will enjoy it. Actually, almost half of all gladiators, as far as we can tell, volunteered to fight. They either had no prospects in their life, those people in the mob that we talked about last time, maybe former soldiers who couldn't catch on with any other kind of job, and those who just wanted the thrill and didn't really see a problem with risking their lives would volunteer to go into the arena. And about 10% of them, as far as we can tell, were women. Gladiatrix, of course, they loved that. It's a little bit like professional wrestling, except people really do die. They're not faking anything. By the way, spoiler alert, professional wrestling, yeah, it's a show. Yeah, they do bleed, it's true, but no, never mind. Okay, so the thing to understand about Rome is the scale on which this custom, this entertainment was practiced. Here we have the Colosseum in the lower left, the largest of the arenas, holds 45 or 50,000 people, like a football stadium. But there were schools of training for gladiators and arenas like the one in the upper right all around the empire. Every major city would have had an arena and the custom of putting on games several times a year. A lot of what they focused on, the majority of it really, was animal fighting. Animals fighting each other, hunters hunting the animals in front of the people, and sometimes they hunted animal species to extinction. There used to be a version of mountain lion that was in the area of Turkey and the Near East. It's gone. There used to be a native breed of North African elephant, north of the Sahara Desert. It was hunted to extinction, the kind of animals that Hannibal used. It was an enormous industry. Look at Trajan, considered one of the good emperors. What he did, putting on a show with 10,000 men, 11,000 animals over the course of a third of a year. Almost 4 months in a row, people in Rome walking around and go, what do you want to do today? I don't know. What do you want to do? Let's go to the arena again. Okay, we went yesterday, but maybe there'll be something new. It's just always there, like the penny arcade. Just go and watch some people get killed. The casual way, the enormous scale of gladiatorial combat is what I want you to think about when you think about the Roman people. How did the show go? Well, the night before, the gladiators all got a big feast. It's the Last Supper, but only in quotes. There's nothing religious about it for them. But, they're eating a beautiful banquet because the next day they might die. And when the show begins, most of it, as I said, has to do with animals. The venaciones and the bestiari are those who handle the animals or hunt them. And they would use them in all different combinations. Animal on animal, like a bear versus 3 wild dogs, or a tiger in a small cage against a boa constrictor, and people would watch and see which one's going to win. And of course, they would bet. They would bet on the outcome. Big money changing hands over which animals are likely to be better than the others in the circumstances that they've laid out. Then there would be these ludi meridiani, these comic shows, sort of like clowns in the circus with padded weapons or flat weapons, whacking each other, Punch and Judy, but alongside that would be these sort of historical displays in which they reenact the battle in which the Romans beat the Carthaginians at the Battle of Zama or something. And all the Carthaginians are just criminals who are underarmed and just being executed. It's really just a gruesome way of executing people or putting on a death show so you can think about history and how we won this glorious victory. But meanwhile, people are really dying to simulate. They're not really simulating the battle anymore. So this is where the Christians were often thrown into the lions. When they talk about the Christians being thrown to the lions, this is where that would actually happen before the real show started. Then all the actual gladiators come parading in with a band and instruments, and it's a huge parade like on Thanksgiving Day, and they would wind up in front of the first citizen's box. Here in Rome, it would be the emperor. You see here in the upper right hand the picture of the man sitting behind the red banner with a bird on it. He would be the emperor, or in the province it might be a praetor or someone who is running the show, who is paying for the show. And they would parade all around and end up right in front of his box and they would give the Roman salute and say, Ave Imperator te moratuli salutant, meaning, Hail, Emperor, those about to die salute you. And he would salute them back. And then the games would start. And they were often paired off in ways that the Romans thought were kind of interesting or representative of something. Down in the lower left, you see an example of 2 men cosplaying probably the most popular kind of gladiatorial combat, the secutor versus the retiaris. The secutor on the left is the one with the sword and shield. He has a little bit more armor on, not a lot of armor, but some. He's considered to represent the element of fire. He moves fast. He's raging. He's powerful, right? Whereas the other guy, of course, the retiaris with the net and trident, is obviously representing water. He's more fluid. His weapons reach farther, but he has very little armor to wear. So fire versus water, they would do that all the time and pair off, several dozen of these secutor versus retiari and see which ones do better. Again, the betting, on and on. When one man is disabled, not killed outright, but wounded and falls, like again, back in the right-hand picture, the winner puts his foot on his chest. Here he is flailing underneath him, and he looks up to the stands. The gladiator looks up to the stands to see what the people and the leader there want to do. And the people either hold their thumb up and yell "mite," saying "send him off, let him live," or they turn the thumbs down and say "jugera," cut his throat. Right? And then the gladiator has to do as he's advised. He'll probably take the main citizen there, his view, but the main citizen will also look to all the stands and see what most of the people want to do, and usually he'll do that. So you see these lovely Roman women here who are saying, they're all saying "jugera," cut his throat. Everyone in a gladiatorial combat is getting judged. Obviously, the loser is being judged. Will he live? Will he die? But the winning gladiator also needs to behave properly and accept the verdict of the masses. And the people sitting in the stands are all segmented in their separate sections: nobles, middle class, lower class down at the end, women sitting separate from the men. Everyone is supposed to behave themselves appropriately as Romans, give the proper judgment up or down after each one of these matches. Everyone is supposed to show that they understand the Roman way and are to do it right. Well, if the verdict is jugera, as we see here, then the gladiator is supposed to stab him and finish him off, at which point out come a few attendants, one dressed as the god Hades with a silver hammer, and the other as Mercury, Hermes, with a wand, which is actually a red-hot poker. And Hades strikes the dead gladiator in the head, in the skull, with the hammer. It's kind of recent news, isn't it? Just to make sure that he's really dead. And Mercury's wand to brand him in case the winning gladiator was trying some sort of trick to maybe get away with something and let his friend get off without dying. They're going to make sure that he's dead, then they're going to drag him away. Look at how Seneca, the great Roman author and poet, describes the way this is supposed to go. He says, "For death, when it stands near us, gives even to inexperienced men the courage not to seek to avoid the inevitable. So the gladiator, no matter how faint-hearted he has been throughout the fight, offers his throat to the opponent and directs the wavering blade to the vital spot." Meaning, you've committed a crime. You are a nuxii. You are an unwanted, shamed person. You've incurred infamia. But now at the end of your life, you can make up for it a little bit by dying like a man. This is the Roman way. This is what they felt was important. These were their values. These are not our values. This is not a modern society. You can make jokes all you want about football or hockey or the way politicians insult each other. This is nothing like that, and we must pray that we stay away from this in terms of what we come to value, the value on life, the value on people. This has got to change. And of course it does change, partly because Rome comes in conflict with this bizarre religious cult that they don't understand and can't really get a handle on throughout all the time that they are running their empire. Romans didn't persecute Christians all the time. Local officers had a lot of leeway to decide, and the Christians learned to hide their ways a bit to accommodate them, looking the other way. But generally, there were three phases of the adversarial relationship between Rome's governors and its Christian population. First of all, what is it that most people believed about Christians in the early days? What had they heard, right? It wasn't good to be a Christian. Nobody wanted to find out too much. So think about a sort of game of telephone. Someone whispers the gospel into the ear of one person, and then they pass on the best they can, whispering to 100 people in a line. What would come out the other end? What does the Roman actually hear second, third, fourth hand about Christians? Well, they're baby cannibals, right? Because their religion is all about the birth of a child and eating the body and blood, right, to become more like their God, who didn't die, even though we obviously killed him. So that's the kind of ridiculous rumor that most Romans believed about Christians in, say, the first century AD, the first few decades after Jesus' death. And at any rate, there are people who won't sacrifice to the emperor. So they're hiding something. They're clearly treasonous in some way. They won't take this little pinch of incense and put it in the fire and say a brief prayer for the health of the emperor. Why, that's crazy. They can't understand what sort of person would be so dedicated as to not undertake this little token sacrifice. So there were three phases of this misunderstanding between Rome and Christianity. And I use a word like misunderstanding, but remember, it was a lethal misunderstanding. At first, Christians were seen as loony, quite possibly dangerous, but Rome as a whole did not launch a campaign to wipe them out. The most egregious slander was made about them, baby cannibals, and in a lack of solid facts, it was believed. Some local governors turned that blind eye, but whenever Christians were outed, they had to be dealt with severely, and so they were killed in some cases. As the sect grew and people found out more about it, the emphasis shifted to the fact that the Christians would not worship the emperor and disobeyed that central edict, something like refusing to take a loyalty oath. And some emperors ordered widespread roundups. Christians began to feed the lions in the arena. But this is where Rome's ignorance and miscalculation really began to backfire. Christians died publicly while singing, praising God, and generally displaying their faith, but without open resistance, without reviling the crowd or the emperor. Rather, they called out forgiveness. This was beyond weird to the rulers, but it signaled the beginning of an interest for the rest of the crowd. After all, Christianity had a powerful personal message for the people watching. That personal salvation was possible. Rome couldn't offer anything in life nearly as good as what the Christians promised after death. And even more strangely, Christians in their last moments appeared to be brave, honest, calm, even peaceful, something the average Roman didn't often feel. So to kill maybe 50 Christians, the Romans put them, the idea of Christianity, in front of 50,000 people. How many of them converted as a direct result? The more Rome prosecuted the faith, the worse their situation became. Finally, the Emperor Diocletian ordered empire-wide organized military-style persecution of the Christians. But apparently it was too late. Many Roman soldiers were already converted. And within 10 years of Diocletian's death, his successor Constantine declared he was a Christian himself. The religion was instantly released from criminal status and protected. Before the end of that century, 395 AD, the shoe was on the other foot, and it was the Greco-Roman paganism that was outlawed. In most important ways, Rome had already fallen, not to the barbarians outside the empire, but to the Christian faith, which in so many ways contradicted it. The conflict of Rome versus the new religion of Christianity was brought to prominence in the Roman arena, and Hollywood has immortalized this. The nature of the conflict shows you the tremendous gulf between Roman culture and anything we would regard as modern. Why did the Romans persecute the Christians so vigorously when they had left so many others alone? First of all, the Romans who did not know the Christians believed those horrible rumors. But even the rulers of Rome knew that Christians posed a great threat to Roman rule, one that could not be tolerated as so many other religious traditions could be. In short, Christianity was not content to stay in its own country, but wanted to spread worldwide. It was a universal religion. And as gentle as it was on the outside, Christianity dared to put Roman rule in second place to a relationship with God, and that constituted rebellion, monotheism. No man can serve two masters. Catching Christians was ridiculously easy. You asked them if they were, and of course they told you the truth. One Roman emperor described the process. You ask them, And if they say yes, you ask them 2 more times after warning them that the penalty is death. If they say yes 3 times, that's it. Here's where the Romans made their mistakes. Figuring that death in the arena was the same as that of any other noxy, they put the Christians in the arena as an example to others. But of course, the early Christian martyrs didn't act the way they were supposed to. They sang songs and held out their hands, forgiving the crowd in their last moments. As you might imagine, this stirred tremendous interest from the Roman population, who certainly didn't see people who looked like guilty cannibals of babies. So as I said, slay 50 in the arena, 50,000 people watch, you might create anywhere from 500 to 5,000 new converts. Rome was essentially a heartless civilization. The people who gave us decimation as a means of discipline weren't going to leave us the civilization we wanted. Internally, Romans were very segmented and stratified, and it showed in their seating rules. The Christians lived together in communal harmony. All men were brothers. As regards other people, Romans generally made war, and the loser incurred infamia, shame, which could only be removed by acting like a Roman. The Christians practiced forgiveness of their enemies and wouldn't change their ways regardless of the threat. Roman culture demanded victory or death. The Christians demanded sacrifice, even unto death. It was all rooted in the revolutionary idea of a God who had created everything in the universe and took an absurd degree of interest in each human being, how they behaved, and whether their intentions were pure. The Romans tolerated you and didn't care what you did as long as you paid taxes and made a token sacrifice to the emperor god. Christians cared deeply about you and wouldn't excuse the slightest deviation from the holy life in themselves, though they freely forgave it in others. To the Romans, the father was a god, right? He could even kill his children. He had total power over them. Of course, we know that Roman fathers, like fathers in every other culture, didn't do that very often. They loved their kids and they wanted them to do well, and they tried to help them do better. Christians kind of flipped the script. They said, yes, there is a God. He is completely in charge of everything. And yet he treats each and every one of us like a father. He loves us. So the term that had very meaningful but different resonance for both sides. Thanks for all your patience listening. Next week, we're going to play the PBL called Lions versus Sheep, and here's how it works. You're going to come into the room and you're going to pull your name out of a hat. You'll either be one of the Christians or one of the Romans. And each round, there'll be 3 rounds in the game, just like the 3 phases that I was talking about. You'll have to make a choice between 2 things, and I'll tell you what they are when we get there. It's one or the other. You make that choice and 2 things happen. One, there's a result for you personally. You might gain or lose as a result of the decision you make. And also it'll have an effect what your group, either the Romans or the Christians, what your group chooses to do as a group, the majority of them, will have an effect on the world. That'll be represented by chips, poker chips. You'll get some or you'll lose some. You start the game with 1 chip and your goal is not to lose any and to gain 2 more. That's the basic idea of the game. And I hope you enjoy it next week. I'll also be giving you some readings to send along with this video link that you can take a look at, which again outline these 3 phases and what people were saying, primary sources, what people were actually saying back then about these different issues. Send me an email with the secret word, which is infamia, right? Just put that in the subject line. You don't have to write anything else. Just say, to Mr. Hahn, infamia, and you'll be off the hook in terms of the homework assignment. I will make listening to this presentation a homework assignment. If you reply all to one of my previous emails and include the secret word in the subject, I will give you a 0 for the rest of the year. And that will be a rare occasion in which I give you a grade and I won't ever take it back. Don't do that. But the secret word is infamia. Thank you for listening to this presentation. I'll close it now and I'll see you guys on Thursday. Bye.